welcome back to World Wildlife Journeys. This is our second podcast in the series on African wildlife and conservation. And today we're going to be talking about the great migration that happens up in East Africa. It runs between Kenya and Tanzania. There's a huge mega herd of wildebeest and zebra that make an annual pilgrimage around that ecosystem. Basically, what they're doing is they're following the rains. So the rains begin earlier in the north. So the whole tribe of them trek up the western corridor up into the Maasai Mara, where the first rains will fall. And then they have to obviously cross the Mara River to get there, and then recross the Mara River to come down to the south, where they will calve in around about February, March, before beginning that whole cycle over again. And I'm tremendously privileged to have with me today a guide who was a mentor to me as a young man when I was studying, and has become a lifelong friend of mine. His name is Dave Christensen, and Dave has been working up in that part of the world for the last 20 years or so. So he's kind of a veteran of the migration, very knowledgeable on the subject. So I would like to welcome Dave to the podcast, and let's pick his brain about the wildebeest. Dave, welcome.
Thank you very much, Russell.
So you were telling me that the burning of the savannahs has a lot to do with the movement of the wildebeest, that they use fire to manage the grassland. I just wondered how long you realized that the wildebeest are drawn to smoking grass, and is there anything that we can do for them?
I think that trend probably started somewhere in the 60s.
These wildebeest are hippies. Well, they certainly look like hippies. They've got the long hair and everything, hey?
Exactly. Yeah.
But David, on a serious note, tell us a little bit about the migration. I mean, it is, what sort of sets this apart around the world? I mean, is there anything that's even slightly comparable anywhere else in the world? I mean, this sort of thing used to go on in every ecosystem. So it would have been a feature of the Great Plains of America and the grasslands of Russia. But essentially, I'm right in saying that this is the last place that it remains intact. Is that right?
Russell, that is almost correct. There's actually one other migration which is considered as big as the wildebeest migration, and that is the white-eared cob migration in Sudan. But apart from that, no, I don't believe that there's any other place on earth that has that number of animals in one place.
And tell us a little bit about it, because, you know, when I talk to people about it, they always point out to me, you know, look, a wildebeest is not the most attractive thing on God's earth. So, you know, 2 million of them, does that really make a difference? But talk to us a little bit about the spectacle. What's the experience like of actually being there?
Okay, Russell, look, you know, if people ask me, you know, if I had to choose one thing in my life to do, to go and see, one wildlife sort of spectacle, what would you recommend? And, you know, almost inevitably, my answer would be go and see the Great Migration.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is, I mean, you take any park in the world, and, you know, I deal predominantly with Americans and a few Europeans. But you go to any park in the world, if you drive around and you see just a handful of animals, particularly in a park in the US or in Europe or whatever, you stop it. It's exciting to see a handful of animals. So now you scale it up to a point where you might be seeing hundreds of thousands of animals at one point in time. It's just, it takes your breath away. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. To see that number of animals in one place. And because of the way the ecosystem is, because a lot of it is very, very open area, and it's not like what we used to here in Southern Africa, where the bush is thick and you know, it's closed in and you can't see very far. It's pretty open for the most part, and so you can see this expanse of wildlife, and it is just something, it's a sight to behold.
It's breathtaking, yeah. And that point that you make is a good one about it being the savannah. And as I always explain it to people, I say, you know, when you think of Africa, that kind of out of Africa scene, you know, from Disney, and that the giant grasslands, that's this part of the world. That's what it has to
It's
offer.
exactly that.
But
Yeah,
now,
it's exactly.
talk to us a little bit about the use of fire in the management of that grassland, because I understand it's quite controversial that the TANAPA or the parks guys will actually go in and deliberately set fires in the grassland to clear off the moribund grass, but that there are some issues over the timing of when they're doing that and whether that policy is actually a sensible one or not. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Okay, Russell. So obviously, you know, I'm not an ecologist. I'm only someone who's got 34 years of sort of practical experience in the bush. You know, looking at things, and obviously, I look at things very deeply. I always question things, and my sort of take on it is the fact that I believe that this sort of ecological practice, or this ecological management tool that they've been using, probably dates back to around the sort of the 60s and 70s, where I believe that burning and that was done. I mean, when you look back at sort of their reasoning, their claim was that they used to burn to kill all the young acacia trees to keep the grassland open for wildebeest. So essentially what it is, it's a form of micromanagement for a single species within the park. And we all know, and I think that even organizations like WWF and people like that, they've changed their entire approach towards conservation. Initially, and I mean, it wasn't even that long ago, 20, 30 years ago, they were talking about, oh, you know, throw money at this particular species because it's endangered. Well, you never hear that anymore. Now it's like throw money so we can actually conserve the entire habitat, because without the habitat, we've got nothing. And we all know that the habitat, shrinking habitat throughout Africa is the biggest threat to wildlife today.
Yeah.
Despite what many people think about, you know, hunting and things like that. You know, that's another topic. But essentially, what we've realized is that if we don't maintain the habitat, then we lose everything. And so, to me, the burning practice within the Serengeti is outdated because they were micromanaging for a single species. So what I want to do is I want to take it back one step, where at the sort of the turn of the late 19th, early 20th century, a well-documented event of the rinderpest, which swept through Africa and wiped out 90% of all bovids on the continent. Okay, so that was obviously very devastating for all the antelope species and things like that.
So just so we're clear, we're talking about, this is a disease that swept through Africa from literally from Egypt to southern Africa, and it wiped out all of the cloven-hoofed animals. So we're talking about all of the buffalo, all of the wildebeest. I mean, I think the statistic in Zimbabwe was that the buffalo population, they thought the buffalo population had died out completely. And then they found a herd of about 30 animals in that Sibungwe region, and there was a group of about 20 that survived down in Gonorrhea. So this is from you know, hundreds of thousands of animals down to a handful of individuals, and that happened across all of the species with cloven hoof. So we're talking zebra, giraffe, I mean, everything, except, interestingly enough, zebra.
Yes.
Zebra is not cloven hoofed. And so I'm going to hand it back to you to carry on talking. But one of the things that I've always been fascinated in is if you talk to the old timers about that migration, they say to you there used to be much, much more zebra. And over years, there have been fewer and fewer zebra and much, much more wildebeest. And I think that's just the tail end of that rinderpest. But as you say, that's another topic for another day. So carry on talking. What would have changed in the ecosystem after the rinderpest and moving forward?
Okay, so you know, I believe that it's very possible that before the rinderpest, the wildebeest numbers could have been what they are today. And the rinderpest obviously wiped them out. Bearing in mind that before that point in time, there wasn't really that much documented history
Yeah.
throughout most of these parts of Africa that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you have the rinderpest wipes out all your bovids basically. So things like your wildebeest, all your antelope species, Thompson's gazelle, and things like that are significant in the numbers today,
Yeah.
they were gone. Fast forward that to around 1966, where Bernard Chimek, the famous zoologist from Germany who worked for Frankfurt Zoological Society, came up. He's really the guy that put the Serengeti and the Ngorongoro on the world map by writing his book, Serengeti Shall Not Die, and so on. So people started becoming aware of it. Frankfurt Zoological Society got involved basically with him coming there and doing all this work. From what I understand, in around 1966, when they did the first aerial survey, the wildebeest count was just under 100,000 animals.
Wow.
So it had basically taken from when the rinderpest hit, you know, in the late 1800s to that point, for it to build up to 100,000 animals. And we all know that with these things, if as long as they have protection and as long as they have food, etc., their numbers are going to grow, and then it's just going to become this exponential growth rate. Now, I just also want to allude to the fact that one of the reasons why this whole migration thing has actually been successful throughout this period in history is that the Serengeti, majority of the Serengeti ecosystem is surrounded by, obviously, tribal people. And the tribe that covered most of the border area of where the Serengeti is, actually including the Serengeti plain. So the Serengeti comes from a Maasai word, Serengit, which means, you know, endless plain. And the name comes from the southern part of the park where it is, the grass never gets more than an inch or two high. It's very, very shallow soils. And basically the grass doesn't get very tall. There's a very thick underlying layer of calcrete in that soil. And so it doesn't allow trees to push their roots through. So you've just got these very extended short grass plains. And because that area was inhabited by Maasai, the wildebeest migration, or the wildebeest populations, the antelope populations, could actually thrive. And the reason for that is that the Maasai people traditionally never ate a wild animal. It was actually taboo in their culture because they believed that if you ate a wild animal, it was because you were poor, because you didn't have any cattle to eat. So their whole lives are really evolve around traditionally cattle. That emphasis is still there, but it is shifting slightly towards more things like sheep and goats, only because they do better in a very dry environment or in a drought condition. But essentially, livestock is what drives them. And traditionally, although there's some changes in that now, the Maasai would never eat a wild animal. So that meant that those animals could actually live there safely without being persecuted.
Yeah,
and that's
the
one of the
Maasai, and the Maasai effectively were playing the part of the park rangers because they wouldn't let any, you know, any of the rival tribes into that area who
correct.
didn't have that same ethos, who were happy to eat the wildlife. So effectively having this group of pastoralists wandering around is what paved the way for the system that we have. And I'm always fascinated, you know, when I started going up there the first time, it was before they'd banned the Maasai from taking the cattle down into the crater. And I remember the first time being down there, just what a surreal experience that felt like. Because here I'm looking at, you know, lions, and there's a buffalo over there and a rhino over there. And then just in the background, here comes this Maasai guy with a spear just sauntering along with his cows. And me being used to Southern Africa, I found that kind of an anathema. This is a place for wild animals, not people. But I must admit, since they've been banned from the crater, I really miss them because they're so much part of the landscape. And it used to make for fantastic photography, because you could get the lion in the foreground and the Maasai with his spear just sauntering past him in the background. So it always struck me that, in fact, that particular change really is what got me to thinking that actually what's missing from all of our national parks in Southern Africa is humans, because we used to be part of that system. And I think a lot of the challenges that we're facing today with, certain imbalances within the parks in Southern Africa, the overpopulation of elephant and that, I think has to do with the fact that we as predators are absent from that ecosystem. And that's what's created that imbalance. But it's that British mindset that, the wilderness must be pristine with, no human presence. But that's not realistic. Certainly in Africa, the whole environment evolved alongside humans, and us hunting animals was part of the equation. So yeah, it's fascinating. And I mean, it really is. It's kind of sad to see what's happening with the Maasai now, that they're increasingly being squeezed out of their traditional homeland. I don't know what your thoughts are on that subject, but I'm kind of sad to see them go.
Yeah, I do agree with you to a point. And obviously, when I first started going down there, you would have the occasional guy going down to water his cattle. But sort of towards the end, as their population has grown, and obviously, Maasai used to be, they used to be very nomadic people. They used to move a lot. And now what's happened is their population has grown to such an extent that there's now no longer anywhere for them to move to. And now, instead of going down and seeing one or two sort of groups of cattle come through, you go down and there's 10, and you're busy watching something at the spring down in the crater, and suddenly here comes a guy and he chases everything away so that his cattle can drink. So it does get to, it gets to a tipping point, which I think we've arrived at, which is, I think, the very reason why they've actually had to say to the guys, look, we will actually pump water for your cattle. And we will give you an alternative place to water your cattle, but basically you're too much of a disturbance now, and so we're going to have to prevent you guys going into the crater.
And the irony there is that from what I understand of it, the migration into that area around the crater has been because of the success of ecotourism. That it's kind of improved the livelihoods of the people living around the park. And this has had the unforeseen consequence of actually attracting more people to come and live around the park. So there's, these are what I always say, and I think we probably repeat ourselves in every episode, but these are complicated issues. And in spite of our best intentions, sometimes we get it right and sometimes we get it wrong. But we've kind of got a little bit off track. Take us back to the burning of the grassland and your feelings on that subject.
Yeah, thank you, Russell. I was actually about to say that. So going back to the sort of fire issue in the Serengeti, essentially it was a form of trying to, from what we understand anyway, it was a form of trying to reduce the regeneration of young acacia trees, and so to prevent it all becoming thick acacia woodland in many places, or thick acacia scrub as it would be for many years. They used to burn to kill all the young trees and keep it as an open grassland. So that's all good and fine. But then you sort of fast forward that thing to present day. Now, in order to understand the whole concept, from an ecological point of view, there's only one reason why you would burn, and that is to eliminate moribund material. So moribund material is basically when a grass grows, it grows a crown, and then it grows from underneath. And then as it grows up, it grows this crown of leaves, and then it grows up from underneath. But eventually that crown of leaves on the top dies, and it prevents the grass from growing from underneath. And so you've got this dead crown of grass that's basically useless. The nutrient quality is very low. Nothing really likes to eat it. It's tough. It's hard to chew. And in an ecosystem where you have animals that move through that area, essentially what they will do, if you have a large number of animals, and even the stocking rate on some of these ranches and that is the concepts have changed. Instead of having a very low stocking rate with just a few animals that selectively eat everything they want, and then move on. And what it does is it actually, it eliminates the really palatable species, and the less palatable species start taking more of a foothold.
Mm-hmm.
So over time, you actually degrade that environment quite substantially.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a higher stocking rate, so let's take, and the wildebeest, the current wildebeest migration is a perfect example, because you've got somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million wildebeest, and they are moving and they're eating. There's a lot of mouths to feed. So they just flatten the grass. What they don't eat, what they don't, break off and chew and eat, their hoof action will actually break off a lot of those crowns.
Yeah,
and so essentially, by having a large number of herbivores moving through an area and a very high stocking rate, they've got to keep moving because they flatten everything. So they've got to keep moving. And by having that action, you're effectively eliminating the moribund material that's there.
Mm-hmm.
So in my opinion, the need for burning is now eliminated because there is no moribund material left.
So what you're saying is, in the 60s, when they enacted this policy, it was maybe necessary, but actually the herd has got so large now that they're actually taking care of that moribund tissue just through hoof action, and that then puts those nutrients back into the soil rather than releasing that carbon into the atmosphere.
Correct. So one of the reasons why I am not that impressed with the current burning regime in the Serengeti is the fact that a lot of the Park Service will actually burn what I see as an inappropriate time. So their concept is that they burn while the grass is still partially green, so you don't get a complete burn. Mm-hmm. Which is better than burning when it is completely dry and you eliminate all the cover for your smaller animals.
Yeah.
But I believe that often just not burning at all, if you get enough action, just not burning at all is better. I mean, one of the things with burning is that so the principle that I subscribe to is like a holistic approach where you try and emulate a natural cycle as much as possible.
Yeah.
The current burning regime is not emulating any natural cycle whatsoever. What is going to start a fire in the wild? It's probably going to be lightning. So when is that going to happen? It's going to happen around the time of the rains, or the beginning of the rains. When the grass is very dry, you get a lightning strike, it burns. The smoke is probably going to generate cloud in itself because the moisture has now got something, little particles to grip onto. It builds up a big rainstorm, it dumps the rain, it extinguishes the fire. So you're going to get this mosaic of burnt areas. It's not going to burn the whole area.
Yeah.
So, that my sort of approach on it is that you try and emulate a natural cycle. Yeah. When you're burning outside of those areas, so let's say you burn earlier in the season, the first thing that happens is that you're leaving the ground now very exposed for sometimes a significant period of time before the rains come. Mm. The wind is going to come, it's going to blow all that ash away. So now when it does rain, it's not washing any of the nutrient from that ash back into the soil. It's the ash has been blown away. The soil is now being baked by the hot sun. And effectively, the first thing that happens the moment you burn, you actually are reducing, you're removing nitrogen from the soil.
Yeah.
So I believe that the condition of the soil actually becomes impoverished more so than if it was in a natural cycle.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. I've had situations where I've gone on safari up to, into the Serengeti, and you're about to go up into the Western Corridor, in, around July, or August, when essentially the migration starts moving up into the Western Corridor around that time.
Mm-hmm.
I get up there in the beginning, or sort of the middle of July, and the whole place has been completely burnt, and the wildebeest haven't arrived yet.
Wow.
So what's going to happen is those wildebeest are going to arrive to a place, and there's going to be nothing for them to eat, which is exactly what happened. Nothing for them to eat, so they just kept moving. So you're now actually interfering with their natural movement.
Mm.
They all went into Kenya. And the interesting thing is, I saw one of the rangers on the side of the road lighting fires, and I stopped and I asked him, and I said, "Why are you burning?" Knowing full well that they'd actually burnt that exact area the previous year.
Yeah.
And he looked at me, and as if I was stupid, and he said, "This is good because it stops the migration going to Kenya."
Yeah. So
So what is your intention? Is your intention to prevent them going to somewhere else and affect their natural movement? What is it? Because I believe that ecologically, there was no need to burn, because there would have been food, and then the wildebeest would have stayed. But
yeah.
because there was no food, it had exactly the opposite effect to what they were trying to achieve, and the wildebeest went to Kenya.
So this is one of those cases of where, there's a practice that's been adopted. It's conventional wisdom that it's a good practice, but there's actually no science to back it up at all.
I believe that the science is outdated. I believe
Yeah.
that they, when they did start it, I believe that the science behind it was to try and reduce, the reforestation of acacias,
Yeah.
and maybe open it up. And also, we know that wildebeest do like that short green grass. Are the wildebeest going to come back? Absolutely, they are. The moment that grass starts sprouting and there's nice short green grass,
Yeah.
everything is going to come back. But in the meantime, I mean, how much damage have you done to the reptile population and the insect population and the snakes and the tortoises and all that stuff?
Can I put a question to you that's always been something that I've wondered about, and I don't know if you've come across any kind of definitive research on this, but when you drive through that ecosystem, even in say if you're down in the south around about September, there are resident populations of wildebeest, right? And then there's the population that moves and migrates. And so the migration moves on, and those wildebeest go with the migration. But then there are these populations which are sedentary, and they don't migrate and they stay where they are. And I've always wondered, if a wildebeest is born into a sedentary population, what are the chances that they go off and join the migration? Or if they're born into the migration, what are the chances that they just go, I can't be bothered this year, I'm just going to stay here? It's always kind of racked my brain. Is it something that, you're born into that, so you do it and that's your culture, and you would never dream of not going and migrating because that's what you've known since you were born? Or whether there is an interchange between those populations where, somebody from a non-migrating family sees a good-looking female wildebeest and decides, what, I'm taking my show on the road.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's something that would actually be worth a study on. Essentially, what I have found with those sort of sedentary populations is that generally they're very small. They're very small groups of animals,
Yeah.
and they're probably the clever ones, the ones that have realized, what, we walk, or we run, thousands of kilometers in a year, and actually, why don't we just stay here? This is better. Uh, I think the realistic scientific facts there are the fact that obviously there's not enough water for the entire population to stay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that what happens is, as a lot of those animals kind of get older and they're maybe not as fit and strong and don't feel like running so far, some of them have realized, well, look, let me just hang here, and there's enough water to basically for small populations to survive and thrive there, while the rest of them have to move because there's just not enough water.
Yeah, that would be an interesting thing to look at, is to just to look at the age of the animals in that sedentary population. I hadn't thought about it being an age-related thing. That's interesting.
But the other thing as well is that when you look at where those isolated populations are, they're almost inevitably in areas where there's some sort of woodland and some sort of water supply.
Yeah.
Once you start getting out onto those open plains where any amount of surface water that gets trapped in those little depressions, where the concrete is closer to the surface, you find that those animals, they have to move. And even the gazelle, I mean, Tommies are very, very amazing little animals, and they can live in pretty dry environments. But eventually it gets to a point where it's so dry, even those little guys have to move.
Yeah.
So it's almost inevitably very small isolated groups of animals, and they're normally always around woodland areas or areas where there's some sort of surface water.
Yeah, interesting. And in terms of looking down the road, in conservation terms, we as guides, having, for both of us, spent over 3 decades, in the wilderness, we can't help but sort of look to the future and say, how have we seen things change, and how do we foresee things change, and what are we concerned about? So for you, what do you think is kind of the biggest threat facing the migration as it stands today?
Yeah, that's quite a difficult question. Obviously, like you say, we've seen a lot of change, and we don't always like it, usually for selfish reasons. I mean, I was being privileged enough to do safaris up to the migration and go up to the eastern, or should I say the northern Serengeti, up onto the Mara River, where we could camp there for a week, and if we were really unlucky, we would see one other car.
Yeah.
And it would be a day visitor who would come in and have a quick look and disappear. We would sit there, for a week and literally have all those river crossings and everything on the Tanzanian side to ourselves.
Yeah, that's changed a bit.
That has changed dramatically. And I think it's fine. I mean, look, it's one of the greatest wildlife spectacles on earth, and I believe that everyone has the right to see it and enjoy it.
Yeah.
I think where we need to be careful, though, is just allowing it just to go uncontrolled and just unabated mayhem, which sometimes happen. I mean, you hear horrendous stories of these guys, rushing up to the river's edge to see, the river crossing, and not be able to stop and actually go over the high bank on the riverbed and endanger the lives of his clients and things like that. I mean, that's just nonsense, in my opinion. It needs to be done. I think they need to really increase the standard of guide quality, where guides can actually respect other guides and other users of the park and things like that, and just have a more controlled environment, that everybody can enjoy it. Then I think no one will complain.
And yet you and I both know that if you just quietly drive off in the other direction and get away from the maddening crowd, there's crossings happening all over the place. So
absolutely,
it's just a case of, the one blessing of that place is that it is big enough that you can kind of disappear off and go and find your own crossing to watch.
100%.
And your feelings on the proposed road into northern Serengeti? What are, it's something that appears to be on the back burner for now. Would that, in your opinion, be a threat? And if so, in what way?
Yeah, so the road does seem to be on hold at the moment. I often wonder about it, and sort of wonder if it's not just a sort of a political thing, just to try and get people to throw money at it,
Yeah.
These sort of things pop their heads up in Africa all the time. We see things. I mean, from being at home, talking about the Batoka Gorge project and the
Yeah.
Mapata Gorge project and things like that. And then they're on the cards and everyone says, no, no, you can't do that. It's going to be bad for the ecology. Mana pools is going to be flooded. Throw money at it. And then it goes quiet.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it's not one of those. But having said that, I think the key with the road, I mean, everybody knows that a wildebeest is capable of crossing a road. I mean, that's not the threat. The threat to building a major road through the northern part of the Serengeti is the fact that the moment you start tarring a road and building that sort of infrastructure, it's going to encourage people to migrate to the edge of the roads. I mean, you can fly over most parts of Africa and you'll find that habitation is all within only a couple of kilometers of the road.
Yeah.
How are people going to get somewhere where they need to buy provisions or where they're going to sell stuff, that they've been growing or sell their produce? It has to be on the edge of a road.
Yeah.
And so what happens is you tar a road like that, and what's going to happen is you're going to have this mass influx of people onto the edge of the road, and it's going to increase the population pressure on the edges of those parks.
Yeah.
Now you've got to understand that the Serengeti National Park, we're not just talking about the national park, we're talking about an ecosystem.
Yeah.
And that ecosystem spills over into the Maasai Mara. It spills over largely into some of the open areas or Maasai village lands that surround the national park on each side.
Yeah.
And the moment you start increasing population pressure on the edge of those roads, it not only increases pressure on the thing, but on the park, but you've also now got a very easy conduit for people to be able to move illicit things removed from the park, like, for example, poaching. I can tell you right now that there's a conservative estimation of a study that was done that they reckon 100,000 wildebeest a year are killed in the Serengeti National Park.
Wow.
For the meat. So 100,000, I mean, 1966, that was the entire wildebeest population.
Yeah.
We do know that the majority of this poaching takes place in the Western Corridor. You've got Wakuria people living in that little V in the top of the Y. The Kuria they're amazing people. They do everything. They farm, they have livestock, they hunt. They've always been very good hunter-gatherer people. They're very, very good hunters. And a lot of those guys will go into the park. They will set kilometers and kilometers of snare line. They will catch wildebeest. They'll cut up the meat. I believe that a lot of them will even take carry the meat out on donkeys, because any undiscerning person on patrol that sees a donkey footprint's going to think it's a zebra. So they carry the meat out and they distribute it. Now, imagine how much that will increase when they now have access to a road, when they're living on the edge of a road in that exact part of the park where the poaching is horrendous.
Yeah.
It's now no longer going to be donkeys, it's going to be truckloads.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that is the problem.
That's a major concern. But as we said, that seems to be, at least for present, on the back burner. I mean, the other one that you and I have spoken about, which I've done quite a bit of research on, is the proposal to dam the Mara River upstream in the Tika Hills. And, that is a project that's been proposed by the Chinese as kind of one of these development type things. But as well as I do that river does not have a particularly high rate of flow to start with, and really is not got a surplus of water that they can start taking out to irrigate fields and that sort of thing. But I guess these governments have a conundrum on their hands. They have hungry people that they've got to feed. They've got citizens who vote for them who require economic opportunity. And so it's a bit of a conundrum. But I know that the environmental impact assessment that was released by the company that's proposing to build those dams, that what they said that they would be releasing from the dams annually was basically the entire flow of the river. So it just doesn't make any sense. Why would you build all the dams if you're planning to let all of the water go downstream? And I think that is, certainly having the Mara River as largely a shadow of its former self. Obviously, the crossings, which are the dramatic thing that draws in people, that then becomes a thing of the past. And that would certainly change the nature of what we've experienced in quite a big way, don't you think?
Yeah, very sadly, I think that a lot of the powers that be, they don't look at things long term enough. I mean, we know, like here in Zimbabwe, how many dams and things have been built on farms so that people can farm and irrigate and things, and only to discover 30, 40, 50, 60 years later that actually it's the worst possible thing for the ecology of any of those rivers.
Yeah.
Siltation is horrendous. Flow rates change. The ecology of the vegetation on the sides of the river is diminished. It's never a great thing. And I think when you look at the migration is something which in the world that we live in today, particularly with populations growing at the rate they are, that is a priceless commodity. And to me, that should be much more of a consideration than farming. I mean, if you need water for irrigation, there's got to be a lot of other alternatives that would probably be just as good, maybe even better. But if you're now starting to affect something which is as has the value that wildebeest migration has got. I mean, not just the amount of long-term income that can bring. I mean, tourism can certainly grow, and even though we go there and we see so many people and so many tourists and think it's becoming overcrowded, there's still potential to do more. And very, very sadly, I think that when these sort of things happen, I think that countries that are affected by, like Tanzania, in my opinion, should now be putting lobbying and getting a major amount of support behind them to basically not allow the Kenyans to go ahead with those dams. And that would be my opinion.
That sort of thing is happening all over Africa. And I think you're right. What you've done is hit the nail on the head. And this is something that I've long believed is that the economists are very good at putting a dollar figure to what, a road through the northern Tanzania or damming of the Mara River, it produces X, Y, Z to the bottom line of the GDP. And they're very accurate at gauging that. But what I think they miss is exactly what you alluded to, is what is the opportunity cost to the country? What is an intact wildebeest migration worth in 100 years' time? I'm telling you, it's a lot more than a vegetable garden. And
100%.
Until we wake up and start putting real, if they were to do that same exercise and say, right, the vegetable garden is going to bring in X at the cost of Y to your tourism, it would be an absolute no-brainer. But it's the same thing as when we do developmental studies. We don't price in what we call the ecosystem services. So the ecological services, we don't put a price on water. We don't put a price on air. We don't put a price on all of these things that are environmental inputs, but we just assume that they're free, but they're not. They come at a cost. And if you started costing that and saying, we're going to buy water, I mean, what is that bottled water sell for? $1 a liter? So you tell me, does your factory make economic sense if you're buying water at $1 a liter? The answer is no. Virtually none of these factories would make sense. And until we start actually pricing those ecological services correctly, the developmental models are always going to be skewed in favor of, or rather against, wildlife and in favor of development. And, I think Africa has a tremendous opportunity because we've been bypassed by this global race to development at all costs, what we've ended up with is a bunch of the poorest people on earth as custodians of what is an absolute treasure trove of biodiversity. And
The
I would
greatest
like to see,
resources.
yeah, I would like to see, funds like the Gates Foundation and that starting to actually make disbursements to African governments to say, we'll pay you not to build the dam. How much is
Yeah,
the dam gonna make you? It's gonna make you X, Y, Z. We'll cut you a check for that because we realize that the biodiversity is more important. I mean, at the end of the day, Dave, the biodiversity is our ticket to survive on this planet. If we wipe out the bees, we're dead. The
correct.
things that pollinate our crops, if we don't have them anymore, we're out of here. So, we need to wake up and start looking at the world and seeing it.
Russell, I also believe it actually goes beyond that, beyond what you've just said. And, when I look at ecosystems in Africa and I look at conservation areas in Africa, almost inevitably they're surrounded by people. And a lot of those people, to a large extent, in majority of the areas, are actually very impoverished.
Mm.
Things like tourism and that provide an opportunity for those people. Now, we all know that it goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Mm-hmm.
These people are, why are people poaching? Why are people cutting down trees and things like that? And it's because they don't have an alternative. Now, income generated from tourism in some of these places, if it was shared better and there was an opportunity, job opportunities, all sorts of things from those people living on the edge of those communities, that is a win-win. If you say building a dam for agriculture or whatever and farming, yes, you're going to provide a few jobs. But at the end of the day, who's going to benefit from all that agriculture? Is it going to be a big corporate farm, a big organization that's run by the government or the Chinese, so the Chinese can take the money back to China, which they've done all through so many places in Africa? Just speak to the Zambians about it and see how much is being taken there. A lot of the minerals in Zimbabwe, all that sort of stuff, it's all going back to China. These governments, I believe, need to actually start sharpening their pencils. They have a responsibility to their people, not to China.
Yeah.
And, I just think that if China wants to build a big dam, so for agriculture and for irrigation and stuff for agriculture, all they're doing is that they're going to be running a company, a big corporate company where they're going to be the benefactors. And the people in those areas are not going to be the benefactors.
Yeah.
Whereas the people living on the edge of these parks, they also need to start lobbying and saying, hey, guys, you cutting us out of this deal. We are the ones, the quality of our lives need to start improving. And this is our golden ticket.
Yeah.
The fact that millions and millions of people across the globe want to come there and see one of the few remaining great wildlife spectacles on Earth. And that's something that we can have forever. It doesn't need to just be a 10-year or 20-year or 100-year time frame. This is something that we can have forever and ever and ever if we look after it.
Yeah.
But the moment you start building dams and affecting that, the long-term financial loss is just, to me, it's beyond comprehension.
Yeah. My friend, what an absolute pleasure to have your words of wisdom. And I'm sure that everybody's going to absolutely love this. So I know that we had some technical difficulties yesterday, and I apologize for those, but I think you'll all agree that it was worth waiting to hear the words of wisdom from Dave Christensen. So my friend, thank you so very much for agreeing to join us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend.
My pleasure, Russell. Thank you very much for the opportunity.